The night sky over Caracas was bleeding orange. Captain Sarah Mitchell could see it through the scratched glass of the cockpit window. Fires scattered across the Venezuelan capital like fallen stars, each one marking another place where order had collapsed into chaos. The smell of jet fuel mixed with smoke drifted through the ventilation system of the C-17 Globemaster, and somewhere behind her, in the massive cargo hold of the aircraft, 134 people were waiting for her to save their lives. She didn't know all their names, she didn't know their stories, but she knew that in approximately 4 minutes, if she didn't make a decision that could start an international incident or get her court-martialed, they would all die on this crumbling runway in the heart of a country tearing itself apart. Her hands were steady on the controls, but her mind was racing through every simulation, every training scenario, every briefing that had led her to this moment. And none of it had prepared her for this. None of it had told her what to do when the tower goes dark, when hostile forces surround your aircraft, when your government's official position is that you're not even supposed to be here. Her co-pilot, Lieutenant Marcus Reed, was staring at her with wide eyes, waiting for an order, waiting for a plan, waiting for her to be the captain she'd trained 10 years to become. And all she could think was a single sentence that would define everything that came next. If I don't go now, we die here. But let's go back. Let's go back to understand how a 34-year-old pilot from Colorado Springs ended up in the most dangerous decision of her life, sitting in an aircraft worth over $200 million, surrounded by armed forces loyal to a regime that had just declared all American military presence an act of war. Let's go back to the beginning of 2019, when Venezuela was no longer just a country in crisis, but a powder keg with a dozen different fuses burning toward the same explosion. Nicolas Maduro clung to power with the support of the military and backing from Russia and China, while Juan Guaido, recognized by over 50 nations as the legitimate president, tried to rally a population exhausted by hyperinflation, food shortages, and systematic oppression. The United States had imposed crushing sanctions, frozen billions in assets, and made it clear that Maduro's days were numbered. But Maduro wasn't going quietly. His regime had armed civilian militias, the colectivos, who roamed the streets enforcing loyalty through violence. The Venezuelan military was fractured, with some units defecting to Guaido, while others remained fanatically loyal to Maduro. And in the middle of all this, the American embassy in Caracas became a target, not officially, not publicly, but through whispered threats, through intelligence chatter, through the kind of pressure that doesn't make headlines until it's too late. In March 2019, the State Department ordered a full evacuation of non-essential personnel. It was supposed to be orderly, diplomatic, quiet, a slow drawdown that wouldn't provoke Maduro or give him propaganda ammunition. But by mid-April, the situation deteriorated faster than anyone anticipated. Protests turned into street battles. Military checkpoints became execution sites, and the American citizens still in Venezuela, diplomats, contractors, journalists, families, suddenly found themselves trapped in a country that was hunting for scapegoats. Sarah Mitchell hadn't planned on being part of the evacuation. She was stationed at Joint Base Charleston in South Carolina, part of the 437th Airlift Wing, flying logistics missions that were important but rarely dangerous. Cargo runs to Europe, humanitarian relief to disaster zones, the kind of flying that required precision and endurance, but not the edge-of-your-seat terror of combat aviation. She joined the Air Force in 2007, fresh out of the University of Colorado, with a degree in aerospace engineering and a dream that had started when she was 7 years old, watching her father, a Gulf War veteran, polish his medals and tell her stories about flying over the desert. She wanted to be a fighter pilot. Top Gun was her obsession. Speed, adrenaline, dogfights at Mach 2. But the Air Force had other plans. She was selected for transport aviation, and after years of training, she found herself in the cockpit of the C-17, a beast of an aircraft that could carry tanks, helicopters, or 170 troops into the most hostile environments on Earth. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't what she dreamed about, but she was good at it. She had over 2,000 hours of flight time. She'd landed on dirt strips in Afghanistan while mortars fell a mile away. She'd taken off from damaged runways in Iraq, with engines screaming and warning lights flashing. She'd flown through thunderstorms that would ground commercial aviation for days. She knew how to handle pressure, or at least she thought she did. On April 18th, she got the call. Emergency deployment, wheels up in 6 hours. Destination classified until airborne. When she boarded the C-17 with her crew, Marcus Reed as co-pilot, Staff Sergeant Jason Chen as loadmaster, and a small security detachment from the Air Force's Special Operations Command, she still didn't know they were going to Venezuela. Not until they were over the Caribbean, and the mission briefing came through encrypted comms. The situation was simple on paper. Land at Simón Bolívar International Airport in Caracas. Load American personnel who'd been consolidated at a secure location. Take off before dawn. In and out in under 2 hours. But nothing about Venezuela in April 2019 was simple. They arrived just after 10 p.m. local time, and Sarah's first impression as they descended through the darkness was how dead the city looked. Caracas, a metropolitan area of over 5 million people, was mostly dark. Rolling blackouts had crippled the power grid. The few lights that remained were scattered and weak, like the city was holding its breath. The airport itself was barely illuminated, just a skeleton crew in the tower and a handful of security lights along the runway. Sarah brought the C-17 down smoothly, the massive tires kissing the asphalt with barely a jolt, and she taxied to the designated hardstand away from the main terminal, engines off, ramp down. The plan was to keep the aircraft as inconspicuous as possible, but there's no hiding a C-17. It's 78 feet tall, 174 feet long, with a wingspan that could cover half a football field. It's a statement. And in Venezuela, it was a provocation. The moment the ramp lowered, Sarah knew something was wrong. The official manifest said 80 personnel, 80 people who'd been cleared, vetted, approved by both the State Department and the Pentagon. But when the buses pulled up, there were more. A lot more. Families with children, elderly contractors who'd worked for American companies and now had targets on their backs. Journalists who'd reported on regime atrocities and received death threats. People who weren't on the list, but were desperate enough to risk everything on the chance that an American aircraft might be their last way out. Major Kenneth Daniels, the ground operations commander, was a 40-something Marine with a shaved head and a face that had seen too many deployments. He walked up to the cockpit, and Sarah could see the sweat on his forehead, even in the cool night air. "How many?" she asked. He didn't answer immediately. "How many, Ken?" 134. Sarah's stomach dropped. The C-17 could carry that many people, technically, but not comfortably, not safely, and definitely not when the mission parameters called for a fast, low-profile extraction. She looked past Daniels and saw them, families huddled together, children clinging to parents, people who looked like they hadn't slept in days. She saw fear, real, raw, unfiltered fear, and she knew she couldn't leave them behind. "All right," she said, "get them on board, fast." Daniels nodded and turned, barking orders to his team. Loadmaster Chen was already directing people up the ramp, organizing them as best he could. But there was no hiding the chaos. People were crying, some were praying, others just stared straight ahead with the hollow look of people who'd seen too much. Sarah stayed in the cockpit, running pre-flight checks, trying to calculate fuel load, weight distribution, takeoff speed. Marcus was quiet beside her, his fingers dancing over the navigation panel, plotting their route out of Venezuelan airspace. They'd fly low, hug the coast, cross into Colombian airspace as fast as possible. Simple, except nothing was simple anymore. The radio crackled. Static at first, then a voice, heavily accented English. American aircraft, this is Venezuelan Air Defense Command. You do not have clearance for departure. Shut down your engines immediately. Sarah's hand froze over the throttle. She looked at Marcus. He was pale. That's not the tower, he said quietly. That's military. She keyed the radio, trying to reach their command center in Bogotá. Nothing. Just static. Someone was jamming their comms. She looked out the cockpit window and saw them. Headlights in the distance, multiple vehicles moving fast across the tarmac, military trucks, armed personnel carriers. She counted at least 6, maybe more. They were heading straight for the C-17. Marcus saw them too. Sarah, we need to go. Now. But the ramp was still down. People were still boarding. She couldn't seal the aircraft and take off with civilians halfway up the ramp. She grabbed her headset and switched to internal comms. Chen, how much longer? 2 minutes, maybe 3. We've got kids, Captain. They can't move fast. She didn't have 3 minutes. The vehicles were less than a kilometer away now, close enough that she could see figures in the back. Armed men, weapons silhouetted against the dim airport lights. 30 seconds, she said into the comms. Everyone on board in 30 seconds or we leave without them. It was a bluff. She wouldn't leave them, but she needed them to move. The next 2 minutes were the longest of her life. She watched the vehicles closing in. She watched Daniels and his team physically lifting people onto the ramp. She watched Marcus's hands shaking as he completed the engine start sequence. She heard the turbines spinning up, that deep, powerful roar that she'd heard 1,000 times before, but never like this, never with the weight of knowing that starting those engines was a point of no return. If she took off without clearance, in hostile airspace, with Venezuelan military forces actively trying to stop her, it could be considered an act of war. She could be starting an international incident that would dominate headlines for months. She could be throwing away her career, her freedom, maybe her life. But if she didn't take off, the people behind her would die. Maybe not immediately. Maybe they'd be arrested, detained, used as bargaining chips. But in Maduro's Venezuela, detention was often a death sentence. She'd read the intelligence reports. She knew what happened to people the regime considered traitors or American collaborators. "Ramp up!" Chen's voice crackled through the comms. "Everyone's on board. Seal it," Sarah ordered. The hydraulics groaned as the massive rear ramp began to close. Sarah's hands moved to the throttle, but she hesitated. The vehicles were less than 300 meters away now. She could see the muzzle flashes, warning shots firing into the air. Or maybe not warning shots. Maybe they were aiming low, trying to hit the tires, disable the aircraft. Marcus was looking at her, waiting for the order. The entire crew was waiting. 134 people in the cargo hold were waiting. And Sarah felt the weight of it all, pressing down on her like the gravity of a collapsing star. She thought about her training, about the rulebook, about the chain of command and proper authorization and the careful diplomatic dance that was supposed to prevent exactly this kind of situation. And then she thought about something her father had told her years ago, the night before she left for officer training. Sometimes, he'd said, you have to make a decision that no one can make for you, and you live with it, or you don't, but you make it. "If I don't go now," she said quietly, more to herself than to Marcus, "we die here." She pushed the throttles forward. The C-17's 4 Pratt & Whitney turbofan engines roared to life, each one generating over 40,000 pounds of thrust. The aircraft lurched forward, heavy and sluggish with the weight of too many people and not enough preparation. Sarah released the brakes, and the Globemaster began to roll. Slowly at first. The runway at Simón Bolívar was just over 3,000 meters long, enough for a normal takeoff, but this wasn't normal. She was overweight. She hadn't calculated exact load distribution. She was taking off at night, in a hostile environment, with vehicles now racing parallel to the runway trying to cut her off. Marcus called out speeds, 40 knots, 60 knots, 80. She kept her eyes on the runway ahead, her hands steady on the yoke. The vehicles were closing in from the left, trying to intercept before she reached takeoff speed. She saw the muzzle flashes again. This time, she heard them, the sharp crack of rifle fire. Bullets hitting the tarmac, some hitting the aircraft. The C-17's fuselage was tough, built to take damage, but a lucky shot to the engines or the landing gear could end this before it started. 100 knots. She needed 130 to rotate, to pull the nose up and get airborne. But there was a problem. At the far end of the runway, she saw more vehicles. They'd blocked the exit. A truck parked sideways across the taxiway, and armed men taking positions behind it. If she didn't get airborne before she reached them, she'd either have to abort or crash straight into them. 110 knots. The vibration of the engines was shaking the entire airframe. She could hear things rattling in the cargo hold, could imagine the terror of the passengers as they felt the aircraft accelerating into what must have felt like certain death. Marcus was gripping the edge of his seat. "Sarah, we're not going to make it. We're not going to clear them." 120 knots. She could see the men at the end of the runway raising their weapons. She could see the truck, solid and immovable. She had maybe 10 seconds to decide: abort and surrender, or commit. 125 knots. She pulled back on the yoke. The nose of the C-17 lifted. The main landing gear was still on the ground, still screaming down the runway, but the aircraft was rotating, the wings beginning to generate lift. 130 knots. She pulled harder. "Come on," she whispered. "Come on." The main gear lifted. For a fraction of a second, the entire aircraft was airborne, but too low, too slow, the truck rushing at them like a wall, and then the C-17 climbed, not gracefully, not smoothly, but it climbed. The landing gear cleared the truck by what felt like inches. She heard Marcus let out a breath he'd been holding for 30 seconds. She didn't. She kept pulling, kept the nose up, kept the aircraft climbing, because they were airborne, but they weren't safe. Not yet. Venezuelan airspace extended 12 miles from the coast. She had to cover that distance before the regime scrambled jets or activated surface-to-air missiles. The C-17 wasn't a fighter. It had no countermeasures, no weapons, no way to defend itself except speed and altitude. She kept the throttles at maximum, climbing as fast as the overloaded aircraft would allow. Marcus was on the radio, trying to reach Bogotá, trying to get someone, anyone, to confirm they were still on mission and not flying a rogue aircraft into an international crisis. Finally, the radio crackled to life. "Reach 79er. This is Bogotá Control. We have you on radar. You are cleared into Colombian airspace. Maintain current heading." Sarah felt her shoulders sag. They were clear. They were out. She leveled off at 10,000 feet and let the autopilot take over, her hands finally releasing their death grip on the controls. Marcus looked at her. His face was pale, his uniform soaked with sweat. "You just," he started, then stopped. "You just took off without clearance, in hostile airspace, under fire." She didn't respond. She was staring out at the black expanse of the Caribbean, her mind still racing, still processing what had just happened. Behind her, in the cargo hold, 134 people were silent. No one was celebrating. No one was cheering. They were just sitting in the dark, holding on to each other, realizing they were alive. 2 hours later, Sarah landed the C-17 at El Dorado International Airport in Bogotá. The ramp lowered, and the passengers disembarked. Some thanked her, some couldn't speak, some just walked away, their eyes still carrying the weight of what they'd left behind. Daniels approached her as she shut down the engines. He didn't say anything at first. Then quietly, "That was the bravest thing I've ever seen, or the craziest." She looked at him. "Still not sure which," she said. He smiled. "Neither am I. But 134 people are breathing because of it." That night, while the passengers were processed and debriefed, while the aircraft was inspected for damage, 3 bullet holes in the fuselage, none critical, Sarah sat alone in a briefing room and waited. She knew what was coming. The questions, the investigation, the potential consequences of what she'd done. The fallback arrived faster than she expected. Within 12 hours, the Venezuelan government had released a statement condemning the unauthorized departure of an American military aircraft from Caracas and calling it a violation of Venezuelan sovereignty. Maduro himself appeared on state television, framed by uniformed generals, declaring it an act of aggression that proved the United States was preparing for invasion. The footage was played on loop across international media. CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera, all of them ran the same story. American military aircraft flees Venezuela under fire. Diplomatic crisis looms. But the American response was muted. The State Department issued a brief statement confirming that personnel had been evacuated from Venezuela due to security concerns, but declined to comment on operational details. The Pentagon said even less. A single line: all personnel and aircraft returned safely. No further comment. Sarah wasn't allowed to speak to the press. She wasn't allowed to speak to anyone outside the chain of command. For 3 days, she sat in a small office at the U.S. Embassy in Bogotá, waiting. On the 4th day, she was flown to Washington, not to Joint Base Charleston, not back to her unit, to the Pentagon. She was escorted through corridors she'd only seen in movies, past offices with names on the doors that appeared in history books. She was brought to a windowless conference room where 5 officers sat behind a long table, 3 generals, a colonel from JAG, and a 2-star admiral who looked like he hadn't slept in a week. "Captain Mitchell," the admiral began, "do you understand why you're here?" "Yes, sir," she said. "You took off from a foreign airport without clearance. You ignored direct orders from a sovereign nation's air defense command. You endangered your crew and passengers by operating in a hostile environment." She stood at attention, her hands behind her back. "Yes, sir." The admiral leaned forward. "You also saved 134 lives, and you didn't start a war." She blinked. That was not what she'd expected to hear. The general on the left, a 3-star with a chest full of ribbons, spoke next. His voice was gruff, the kind of voice that had commanded troops in Iraq and Afghanistan. "What you did, Captain, was technically a violation of a dozen different regulations. If we wanted to, we could court-martial you. We could end your career." There was a long silence. "But we're not going to do that." Sarah felt something loosen in her chest. "Instead, you're being awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for extraordinary achievement while participating in aerial flight. The ceremony will be private. No press, no publicity. Officially, this mission is still classified. You will not discuss it. You will not write about it. You will not confirm or deny anything to anyone outside this room. Do you understand?" She nodded. "Yes, sir." The ceremony took place a week later, in a small room at the Pentagon. No cameras, no audience, just the same 5 officers and Sarah's family. Her father, now in his 70s, stood with tears in his eyes as the medal was pinned to her uniform. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Afterward, she was reassigned. Not punished, but moved. Quietly transferred to a training command in Alabama, where she would spend the next year teaching the next generation of C-17 pilots. It was a good assignment. Respectable. Safe. But it wasn't flying missions. It wasn't the edge. And part of her missed that. For months, she didn't talk about what happened, not to her friends, not to her fellow pilots, not even to Marcus, who'd been transferred to a different base and whom she only saw once, briefly, at a conference in Nevada. They'd exchanged a look, a nod. That was it. But the 134 people who'd been on that plane didn't forget. Some of them reached out. Letters, emails, messages through official channels, thanking her, telling her their stories. One woman, A journalist named Elena Vasquez, who'd been on the flight with her 2 children, sent a handwritten letter that Sarah kept in her desk drawer. "You didn't just save our lives," Elena wrote. "You gave us a future. My children are in school now. They're safe. They're happy. And every night before they go to sleep, I tell them about the pilot who didn't hesitate." Months turned into a year. The headlines about Venezuela faded. Maduro remained in power. The crisis continued, and the world moved on to the next disaster. But Sarah carried it with her, not as a burden, not as trauma, but as a weight she'd chosen to bear. Because that's what command was. That's what decisions were. You make them in the moment when no one else can, and you live with them forever. 2 years after Caracas, Sarah was promoted to major. She returned to active airlift operations, flying missions across the Middle East and Africa. She never spoke publicly about Venezuela. When people asked, she gave the official line, "Classified, can't discuss it." But sometimes, late at night when she was alone in a cockpit flying over some distant ocean, she thought about that moment. The moment when she pushed the throttles forward and committed to a decision that could have destroyed everything. And she wondered if she'd do it again. The answer was always the same: yes. Because in the end, it wasn't about regulations or diplomacy or politics. It was about 134 people who deserved a chance, and a pilot who refused to let them die waiting for permission to live. Sarah Mitchell still flies today. She's never given an interview, never written a memoir, never sought recognition for what happened, but the people who were there remember. They tell their children, they tell their friends, and somewhere, in the quiet corners of military briefings and classified reports, her name appears: Captain Mitchell, Caracas. April 19th. Emergency evacuation under hostile fire, and underneath, in the dry language of official assessments, a single line: mission accomplished. All personnel recovered. No casualties. There are stories the world forgets. Stories that don't make it into the history books because they're too messy, too complicated, too classified to share. But we will keep telling them, because somewhere in the gap between what's written down and what actually happened, there's truth and courage, and the kind of human decision that defines what it means to stand at the edge and choose to jump. If this story made you feel something, if it reminded you that real heroism isn't always loud or public or celebrated, then pass it on. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, because these stories matter.